Hey folks, welcome to the surface of the sun, where you hear the Unsung podcast. My name is Mark Fraser, and I'm joined by two very warm, very sweaty, very red men.
Can I just to just give this a little bit of perspective, Mark? As we know, we've got listeners in the United States who are 117 degrees Fahrenheit at the moment, and there's people we know we've got listeners in Pakistan, and I'm guessing they're not far off that. So Scotland basking in a balmy 24. It's
27 degrees here. 27. That's
degrees.
Also that's 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So you know,
It's got a humidity of like 90% as well. It's not fucking pleasant.
that's jacket weather for most of our listeners.
Yeah, I'm not complaining at all. I've tried to just be outside and bubble my skin as much as possible because
It's lovely.
It's rare for us to get days without rain.
Yeah, I mean, for the first time in Scotland, if you lie down in the street, people don't automatically phone and report a dead body.
Tarmac is moving under people's feet in certain parts of the country right now. That's mental.
Sticking to shoes.
Yeah.
So, are you guys ready to get an election?
I am, but
Yeah, let's get weird. But first,
yes, but first.
But hang on, are you also ready to get a little bit wacky?
yes, but also first.
But first, yeah. So this is our unannounced / undecided episode that the listeners are like, what's going to happen? Oh, I can't tell. They're on the edge of their seat. So to keep them on the edge of their seat another 30 seconds or so, Mark, what you got to get off your chest?
Okay, so we've had some actually really good contributions from people on our Patreon recently, commenting and stuff, really enjoying our bonus episodes as well. We want to bring more people into this group, so go to unsungpod.net/donate, where you can see some cool things you can give us for your hard-earned cash, including some really nice bonus episodes, which I listened to earlier on, and I've got to say are pretty damn good. So you guys are in for a fucking treat. But also, if you're maybe not a bit flush at the moment, and it's fine, you know, everybody wants to go on holiday, I understand. Or go and just sit in the sun.
If you're British, you're not welcome anywhere right now, I'm afraid.
If you don't fancy paying us in cash, you can pay us in kind. If you could share this episode, share any episode, share this podcast with your friends, your family, your lovers,
A good first date would just be sitting down and listening to maybe 4 or 5 different episodes in a row. I think that would, with no discussion, see how new date reacts. I think that would go down really well.
I know that's what I do.
Yeah.
That explains everything. So so if you could do that, just share it, just tell a friend about it, even direct message them, just send them fucking snail mail, send them a carrier pigeon, whatever, just do that'd be awesome. But now, Christopher, you want to tell us what we're doing this week?
Yes, we got to the end of an episode, we hadn't decided what was coming up, so it kind of gave me carte blanche. You notice that carte blanche is a French phrase, by the way. There's a clue.
Qu'est-ce que c'est?
So today we are going to discuss the career and a specific set of works by, yes, you are hearing this correctly, the 19th century French pianist Erik Satie.
Penis?
Yeah, 19th century pianist. And I think something we need to kind of like get out the road here is that with 19th century music, any classical music, the notion of covering an unsung album doesn't necessarily apply, because these pieces are performed and recorded and released over decades, over millennia, literally, in some cases by different groups and collectives. So we're going to focus on a collection of works by Satie called Gnossienne 1 to 6. These are just a very, I mean, it's only about 14 minutes in total. It's a very short set of bits of music, but we'll explain that. He's kind of the locust of his era. Actually, no, he's sort of the opposite musically, isn't he? But then again, very to the point. very, very succinct for a classical musician. Anyway, Satie is an amazing guy. The Velvet Gentleman, an absolute legend. Totally fascinating. I owe quite a lot to a mini documentary on YouTube by the History Channel on him, and a couple other pieces that I'll credit as we're going through this. But really an amazing character, and an incredible innovator, and I'll make the case for that as we go. Guys, this is a bit of a history lesson, so feel free to jump in. But I'm going to take us on a guided tour of the life and works of Erik Satie, starting now.
No.
No.
Erik Satie was born in 1866 in Normandy in France. His mum's maiden name was Jane Leslie. She was born in London to two Scottish parents. He moved to Paris at the age of 4, but his mum really sadly died when he was only 6, and he moved back to Normandy to live with his grandparents. That's actually where he first began to learn music. He was taught by a local organist until his grandmother also died when he was just 12, at which point he moved back to Paris to live with his brother Conrad and his dad, who by that point had remarried to a pianist, thus continuing his musical education. The year 1879, Satie entered the Paris Conservatoire. He was generally described as being naturally talented, gifted, but also lazy, unmotivated. I think that one tutor called him the laziest student in the conservatoire.
Reading his biography, at many points I feel I don't just have things in common with him, but I aspire to be what he is in many ways.
You know, it's the weirdest thing, but there's so many things about him that I identify with. But yeah, one tutor called his particular technique insignificant, laborious and worthless, because as you'll find out, Erik Satie had a very distinct approach to piano and to music and composition. He at one point dropped out and then re-enrolled at Conservatoire, but ended up dropping out again because frankly his attitude and his work ethic hadn't really changed. He enlisted in the army, but he only lasted a few months. He was discharged, and this foreshadows many wacky bits of behaviour. He was discharged for apparently infecting himself with bronchitis. In 1887, he moved to Montmartre in Paris. Montmartre is still a very, very cool, very hip area of Paris. It was like a little sort of villagette within the city at the time. It was an artist's hub and a sort of hipster party enclave. It was kind of like moving to West Princes Street, I guess, in Glasgow. In this period, he frequented places like the famous Le Chat Noir Club, which is that ubiquitous poster in students' rooms next to Pulp Fiction. No, I guess if you were a guy when you were young, you had Pulp Fiction. If you were a girl, you had Le Chat Noir. That was that kind of thing.
So he frequented. He played piano there too.
Yeah, regularly. And he kept a lot of really hip company there. He befriended a really young Claude Debussy. That's the composer behind things like Au clair de la lune. Two arabesques and La Mer. A really famous guy who'll reappear later on in this. Around this time, Satie composed a number of pieces. Ogive, now I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce this, Gymnopédie, which apparently is something to do with naked young boys dancing. I don't really know. Sarabande, and then Gnossienne, which we're obviously going to revisit later on. I mean, at this time, by the late 19th century and the early 20th century, Paris was like the arts capital of the world. It was just incredible on almost every level and at the forefront of every artistic movement, more or less. In 1891, he had a little interesting deviation. He became the official composer of the Rosicrucian order, working from the Salon de la Rose et Croix. Rosicrucianism, if you're not familiar, is a 17th century mystical belief system. It incorporates parts of many other mystical systems, and it promised basically universal reform in accordance with a bunch of selected ancient teachings. It included subsects that we've actually touched on before on the podcast, such as the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, that included famous people like Aleister Crowley, Bram Stoker, W.B. Yeats. I think we spoke about it during a Nexus that was something to do with Benjamin Franklin and burning down the Glasgow Tron Church. I don't know if you guys remember that.
Yeah.
So Satie at this time began to release his own religiously themed pamphlets that he would reproduce and hand out, and actually ultimately set up his own sect in 1893, albeit I think he was probably the only official member. It was known as the Metropolitan Church of Art of Jesus the Conductor. Could well have been a bit of a piss take. Ultimately, those pamphlets sort of really mainly criticised his own critics and the critics of good friends, including one particular nemesis known as Willie. His real name was Henry Gautier Villers. It reminds me of the one-eye, the monobrowed baby in The Simpsons. But this guy, Willie Satie, actually ended up organising a fist fight with. Such was the level of their animosity. In 1892, Satie announced a satirical, quote, anti-Wagnerian hoax opera called Le Bâtard de Tristan that was probably never actually composed, but it was kind of there to depict his animosity towards the Romantic movement and Wagner personally. I think perhaps there's a bit of political motivation in that as well. He's certainly, given Satie's own left-wing leanings and progressive tendencies, I think he was diametrically opposed to a lot of what Wagner stood for. Wagner was a reprehensible cunt of the highest order.
See, when we talk about his music, it'll probably come up as well, but you can tell that all of his music was definitely, the minimalism was a total kickback against the grandiose, like, Romantic movement in general, you know.
Yeah, and he proselytised against it. He did the most he could to turn people away from it, not least of all Debussy. He didn't reject Romanticism outright completely. He didn't throw all of it, the baby in the bathwater, but he certainly rejected many purveyors, especially Wagner. He maintained some elements, but one thing that he avoided was long evolving pieces of music. Now, by the way, I love music like that. Bands like Godspeed You Black Emperor really embrace that sort of notion of starting somewhere and developing it and going through movements and ending up somewhere else. I mean, that is in some ways Wagnerian. It's he was one of the highest profile purveyors of Romanticism in music, but Satie really pushed back against that. He preferred simply to kind of expose a main theme or themes and then repeat or simply end, and it kind of led to much shorter works. And as I say, he really encouraged and influenced people like Claude Debussy and others away from that school of thinking.
Do you know, I think it was quite interesting when I was listening to a lot of his stuff, is that it follows the same exact kind of structure as a lot of pop music does now. Like A, B, A, B, A, B, C.
That's been commented on in some of the, like, I read a number of articles in classical blogs and magazines, and they said that they think he is one of the originators of pop structure.
Yeah, because it keeps coming back to a chorus basically, a repeating melody, and he loved repeating melodies, right? Very, very important thing to him. Yeah.
Gnossienne 1 is the perfect example of that. It's basically got 3 parts. Yeah.
It just reminded me of a lot of poetry repeating structures, of stanzas, you know what I mean? It kind of reminded me of that, and then it made me think about Nirvana, verse, chorus, verse.
Yeah,
and it's exactly the same.
Yeah. In 1893 is a really key development in him and in his personal life, and that would also influence his creativity. He began seeing a woman called Suzanne Valadon, who, by the way, is a stone cold fox. I don't know if you've seen any pictures of her, but they used to paint portraits of each other. She's absolutely fucking stunning. Like, she's beautiful. She was both an artist and a muse at the time for other artists. He fell deeply in love with her. He actually asked her to marry him after one day together. She refused, but they stayed together and they became an item for about 6 months or so. I think she moved into an apartment right next door to him, and they regularly painted portraits of each other, hence why there are so many portraits. But then she kind of suddenly, I think after 6 months, decided she was going to move away and ended the relationship, and Satie was devastated. This is still his only known romantic relationship of his entire life. I think he described it afterwards, like when she left, as nothing but an icy loneliness that fills the head with emptiness and the heart with sadness. And his writing at this period really depicts both the highs, the tension, because you get the feeling that he was desperate not to lose her, and then the lows when he did lose her. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Very briefly, in 1895 to 99, he did work as a cabaret pianist. It is actually significant in his catalogue. He adapted a lot of compositions, although he later disavowed them as, quote, vile, and said they'd only been done for pay. Although I do think the elements of that experience would stick and pop up in some of his future work. Music like Jack in the Box and The Dreamy Fish are two examples from that era that still survive and were actually discovered in his apartment after he died. In the early 20th century, he wrote and performed many pieces for children that proved very popular, and he also began to later write and publish comical sort of, quote, miniatures, which was kind of pioneering in itself, to do comedy music, comedic music. It did exist in the kind of bawdy sense of like pub sing-alongs and kind of the music of the lower classes, but for a sort of higher class musician, the high art musician, to start doing this kind of stuff, that was quite remarkable. And those actually became really popular on the Parisian theatre and nightlife scenes, especially when word got around that a new one was coming out. And also around that time he stopped using bar and time signatures altogether. Towards the later stages of his career, when his earlier works, such as the ones we're going to discuss in more depth, were discovered by a new generation of fans known as the jeunes, the young, he rejected that mainly because he felt it led to his newer pieces being overlooked or dismissed. So even though his earlier compositions were actually getting the recognition they probably deserved, he kind of took the hump. And he does this a lot. I mean, he's a really fickle guy. You'll see how he reacted to Debussy later. Key thing that he did in 1917, he embarked on a joint project with Pablo Picasso and a guy called Jean Cocteau. So Picasso was designing the set and the costumes, obviously, and Cocteau was doing the script and Satie was doing the music. The whole point of this musical parade was intended to cause controversy and specifically to try and bring Jean Cocteau notoriety. I mean, Picasso had put in these crazy amorphous sets and costumes that were made of cardboard that made it really difficult for the dancers to move. The music that Satie had created was performed using glass bottles, typewriters, a foghorn, a pistol. That's significant though, that will come, but we'll mention that later on because that's also credited as being a forerunner for an entire school of musical thought called musique concrète or concrète. That's kind of a modernist venture that utilised unorthodox instrumentation. Predictably, audiences and critics hated it, especially a critic called Jean Pieux. I don't really know how to say his name because it's spelt with too many vowels, and the French fucking love doing that. They'll put in loads of vowels and then say almost none of them, but he famously slated it. Now this led to a very famous moment in Satie's life. Satie then sent Pieux a postcard saying, "Sir and dear friend, you're an arse," and an arse without music. Which actually sounds like the kind of thing Dave would say when he's being sort of tongue-in-cheek cheeky.
If only I could be so succinct.
Pieux sued him on the grounds of cultural anarchy. And he was found guilty and he got 8 days in jail for that postcard. Can you fucking imagine Satie on Twitter?
How did I get sued for cultural anarchy? I want to make it happen.
It's like a badge of honour, isn't it? You get sued for cultural anarchy. I kind of get the feeling he took it as a badge of honour as well. And yeah, also famously, Jean Cocteau was both beaten and restrained in court for repeatedly interrupting proceedings by shouting arse, which is brilliant. Now, what becomes really apparent is that Satie was an amazing musician, a fascinating musician, very innovative, right? But he was also a just a ridiculously huge personality and character. To give you some insight into this guy, some quotes by him that I thought were particularly interesting. I came into the world very young in an age that was very old. I am by far your superior, but my notorious modesty prevents me from saying so. This is an interesting one because he does have a really odd demeanour despite all the wackiness, and it's really difficult to sort of parse sometimes if he's being ironic and silly or if he's actually really a bit of a nut job.
I don't know. I think everything that I've read, like direct quotes of him, was being completely ironic in every single way.
Well, yeah, I think his entire life he was like the OG troll. He's just everything is sarcastic.
It seems like there's merit to that claim, but he says, my expression is very serious. When I laugh, it is unintentional, and I always apologise very politely. But also, I think a key one, the fourth quote I have here, I have never written a note that I did not mean. In context as well, that really seems sincere. I think he was trying to make the point that the music that he was writing, he was taking really brave forays into new territory, but the music wasn't taking the piss. If the music did something that was innovative, he sort of meant that genuinely. You know, his personal life and some of his other stuff was a bit off the wall, but the music was a sincere venture most of the time, at least it seems. That said, he performed a lot of time in red light districts and stuff for good pay, but perhaps like maybe the titles of some of the songs reflect his dismissive attitude to what I assume were frequently drunk and rowdy audiences that he dealt with. So we've got some great titles here. 2 Preludes for a Dog, Floppy Preludes, brackets, for a dog. Real Flabby Preludes for a Dog. Sketches and Annoyances of a Big Man in Wool. Desiccated Embryos, which just sounds like a Cannibal Corpse song. Sea Cucumber. A personal favourite, Muscular Fantasy. The Bearer of Big Stones. Do not drink your chocolate with your fingers. Do not put your head under your arm. These all sound like Zappa tracks. To be jealous of a comrade who has a big head. Another Zappa one here. Enjoy his horny feet to take her hoop. Definitely a Zappa one here. Rat air.
Right.
Things Seen Right and Left Without Glasses, which is actually quite a favourite one in his canon. And 3 Pieces in the Form of a Pear. The reason that's wacky is because actually the song had 7 pieces.
Yeah.
And it's just been a prick. I mean, there are loads of other general sort of eccentricities that I'll skim through here. He called himself a phonometrographer, not a musician or not a musician or a composer, and he insisted that phonometrography was more mathematical and grounded in science and thus a higher art than either of the others. He became a member of the Communist Party in 1920. I mean, this is what, 2 and a bit years after the October Revolution. That's after many years as a member of the Radical Socialist Party, and I guess that kind of underscores his political opposition to the likes of Wagner as well. He wrote a bunch of stupid articles, some of which got published in Vanity Fair thanks to his friendship with Gertrude Stein. One of the articles described his love of ducks and salmon. This is brilliant. Quite early on, he had a collection of tiny replica buildings made out of paper and card, hidden in a cupboard, like some little Sims town, right? And each of the buildings had written on the walls a type of metal, and he would occasionally advertise in proper French newspapers things like small lead house for sale.
Tremendous.
It's amazing. He had quite a lot of success with a bit of music called Messe des Pauvres, which is something of the poor. I don't know what mess means. And that actually was quite unusual in his works because it featured vocals. With that money, he bought 7 identical grey corduroy suits that he then wore, and only wore them, for 10 fucking years.
I read that he what, 12 velvet suits, 6 of which were still unworn when he was found dead in his apartment.
I don't know if that's true, but I know that the 7 identical grey corduroy suits were a thing, and he referred to himself during that period as the Velvet Gentleman.
Yeah,
that's where that name came from. By the way, that
which is definitely the Velvet Gentleman is definitely something that you can buy in a pub toilet from a machine.
It kind of puts Henry Rollins to shame, because he used to boast of it, going on tour with just his army surplus, same sized combat trouser, black t-shirt. Those suits, by the way, those 7 suits, after his death, loads of crumpled papers and things were found stuffed into all the pockets and nooks and crannies of those suits, including bits of music and unfinished works. That was like a treasure trove alone. From like the early 1900s, when he was in his 30s, he'd moved to a commune south of Paris, and he reportedly lived in absolute squalor. And for the last 27 years of his life, he doesn't have any visitors. He wouldn't allow them. After his death, his landlord went down to start going through everything, and it looked like the home of a hoarder. We've all seen those pictures of like mountains of newspapers that people can't throw out, mountains of this, mountains of that. So his landlord found more than 100 umbrellas in the house. Brilliantly, there were 2 almost identical grand pianos stacked vertically, and apparently he used to compose on the bottom one, and then the upper one was just jammed full of unsent letters that he'd written and unopened parcels that he'd received, and there were also in and around that house and the piano and stuff that hundreds and hundreds of examples of previously lost or unseen, unheard works, many of which were later released, including 3 that we're going to talk about in detail today. He died in 1925 of cirrhosis of the liver, which might have had something to do with his apparent absolute fucking love of absinthe. And to underline the eccentricity of the man, his last recorded words on this planet were, "Ah, the cows."
Superb.
Now, from the stuff that was found in his house, a book came out in 1981 that was kind of collated, and its title was Memoirs of an Amnesiac, but its full title is Memoirs of an Amnesiac, to be read far from the herd and the mummified dead, those great scourges of humanity. The book makes for an amazing read. It's really strange and insightful, sometimes profound, sometimes, as you say, just really seems like trolling on a massive scale. You cannot talk about Erik Satie and not mention his daily routine that he outlined in that book. So I've maybe skipped over some things, but 7:18 in the morning, he would rise. Between 10:23 and 11:47, he would be inspired. Between 12:11 and 12:14, that's 3 minutes, he would lunch. 1:19 to 2:53 in the afternoon, horseback riding, of course. 3:12 to 4:07, more inspiration. 4:27 to 6:47, one or a combination of fencing, reflection, mobility, which I assume is a kind of old word for yoga.
Immobility. I've seen immobility as, and he would just sit there and do fuck all.
Just not
really?
moving. Yeah,
that's amazing. That's even better. 60 minutes past 7 to 7:20 was dinner. Again, that's 4 minutes. 9 minutes past 8 to 9:50, symphonic readings out loud, and then at 37 minutes past 10, bed. Also, once a week on Tuesdays, he would apparently rise at 19 minutes past 3 in the morning to get an early start. I mean, wow. He, in that book, says he ate only white food: sugar, fat, grated bone, veal, coconut, salt, turnips, chicken boiled in white water, cheese, only white varieties, and some fish skinless. He's also recorded as having eaten 150 oysters in one sitting, as well as a 50 egg omelette on another.
He used to also boil his wine and then drink it cold.
Also, he would never talk when he was eating for fear of strangling himself.
For fear of strangling. Yeah, what in the absolute fuck.
My favourite one is when he goes to sleep. It's like, I sleep with one eye closed very profoundly. My bed is round with a hole put through with a hole to put my head through. Once every hour, a servant takes my temperature and gives me another. What the fuck does that mean?
Like he had fucking servants living in that dump as well. Okay, so an amazing guy, like just so much fucking value for money in his life story. But let's look at like a few of his works. I want to give a wee bit of credit here. There's an article called Essential Erik Satie by a guy called Robert Rowett. It was written in 2016 for CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. You can find it online, and a really, as well as that History Channel mini documentary on YouTube about him. It's brilliant. It's really insightful. I've kind of skimmed some stuff off it, as well as putting in some of my own notes here. Some of the key bits of music in his life, the one that you have to mention is called Trois Gymnopédies. This was in 1888, and I mean, it's his best known set of compositions.
I think most people have heard it. It's been in a lot of films. It's just a classic. Like, it's hugely used.
The problem is most people don't know who Erik Satie is, and I think what Trois Gymnopédies really underlines is why he's a great unsung musician, because you absolutely have heard this, and it's just this incidental bit of like gentle, beautiful piano music. You know, it's there it's in your back of your consciousness, but you don't know anything further about it. And what amazed me was when I first discovered this guy, stumbled across him really, I was like, the guy that did that has all of this amazing backstory. It's just so fucking brilliant, and hence I was really happy to get a chance to sort of bring it to people's attention. Using it to quote Robert Rowett on that, with their winding quarter note melodies and slowly waltzing left-hand accompaniments, the Trois Gymnopédies, they're often found on relaxation compilations. They're also decidedly anti-virtuosic. You don't need to be Franz Liszt to make music on the piano, he seems to be saying. In fact, many pianists are drawn to these pieces because they are so easy to play. It is interesting though, the easy to play thing gets a mention later on, but David Jalbert, a pianist, mentioned that a piano can't sustain long notes forever, and sustained sound often comes at the cost of a rather loud attack, which is not the kind of thing that one looks for in the melodies of Trois Gymnopédies. There's a lot of nuance to it. It's quite basic in its arrangement, but there's a lot of flair and a lot of feeling.
And that kind of brings something quite interesting to the table, because we're talking about a piece of music written by a composer and then interpreted by many different, players and recordings and stuff like that. And you can go out and you can listen to, there's about 50 different recordings of each of his things just on Spotify alone, and they all sound different. Which is really interesting because, normally the production and the recording is all just part of the album. So you have to do a little bit of research and work out, which is the most honest and true recording to the spirit of, how it's supposed to be written. And it certainly appears that, absolutely. It's not seemingly, a hard and fast, rule, and hence why there's so many variations on it.
Another one that deserves a mention is Sarabande. One of his very early works that I think has been more appreciated as time's passed. In that set of music, he actually makes use of a lot of really unusual scales and dissonance. And a lot of that dissonance sits really unresolved in the music. It's seen as being quite uncomfortable. At times it's quite challenging, and it's very atypical for the period. The French composer and critic Alexis Roland-Manuel wrote in 1916 that the Sarabande represented, quote, a milestone in the evolution of our music, pieces of an unprecedented harmonic technique born of an entirely new aesthetic which create a unique atmosphere, a sonorous magic of complete originality. And it's difficult for us because we take so much for granted in our and the musical world that we emerged into. There was so much in place already that we're having to go back through it and pick it apart and try and find the origins. And it's fascinating to hear how he was received at the time. In this case, how he was received 30 years later. How, it is stunning to see the legacy that Satie, seems to have.
It's that use of dissonance, I think, which is quite important across a lot of his work, and from what I'd read, he also innovated in quite a lot of new scales, using a whole lots of chromatic things that I suppose we would that are more conventional in rock music now.
But there's also a lot of Middle Eastern scales that are part of what we consider
conventional rock music now as well.
Another one to mention, now we talked about his cabaret work earlier on, is Je te veux. Cabaret style song that emerged after he dropped out of university and had to make money playing in public cafes and bars. Hence, the original minimalist style became infused with moments that were more readily suited to that environment and better received by those audiences. You know what I mean? It's cabaret. People aren't necessarily paying full attention, but they also want to be entertained. And I think that incorporation of slight flavours of cabaret would become an ongoing aspect in his work. We mentioned earlier on 3 pieces in the form of a pair because it's got 7 parts to it. Trois morceaux en forme de bois. It's seen as being a bit of a sarcastic response to some criticism from his friend Claude Debussy. Claude Debussy had written, "Now, as a true friend, may I warn you that from time to time there is in your art a certain lack of form." And clearly Satie took the hump with that. The melodic lines in that sort of refuse to conform to traditional accompaniment. There's always some element in it, harmonic or rhythmic, that isn't quite right. That's challenging our sort of preconceived notions of how music should go. There's little dissonant couplets and a kind of undulating weight in the playing. It feels deliberately uneasy, and at times it's like, if you can imagine a visual metaphor, it's like 2 versions of a stereo image, like a red and a blue, kind of struggling to sort of sync up and come into focus. It just seems very slightly out, and it's interesting because it's not overly dissonant, but it does knock you off a wee bit. We spoke about Desiccated Embryos, Embryon Dessèche from 1913. It was made up of multiple movements named after marine life. The first one, Sea Cucumber, which you also mentioned, is basically a toccata, which is like a fast-moving, busy, almost unceasing, lightly played flurry of perpetual motion. It's kind of quite whimsical, and maybe to the untrained ear, which mine definitely is, sounds more conventionally classical than you would probably expect, given the other things we're saying about this guy. 1893, really important piece or collection, Danse Gothique. 12 pieces that were written during the height of that love affair with Suzanne Valadon. They're kind of dark and unconventional with shifting chords. They're hardly jubilant, but they are kind of like interspersed with little glimpses of resolved harmony. It speaks to a darker and kind of slightly more anxious, obsessive kind of love that I was describing. I mean, you get the feeling that Erik Satie was so in love with Suzanne Valadon that he was scared of that a wee bit, that he was almost scared to lose her. And I mean, by all accounts, he went to pieces after she left. And that kind of, so the music seems consistent. And indeed, this was written during the affair, but after she left him, only one of the 12 pieces was ever published during his lifetime. The rest all came out posthumously. He couldn't face this music. It was too evocative of those memories. Now, a really, really interesting piece of work in his collection is Vexations from 1893, going back a bit. This was written upon the breakdown of that relationship. It's half a sheet of music, half a sheet of like notation that is to be repeated 840 times. Now, it's like deeply misanthropic and very challenging. Even the concept was intended, I think, to represent the crushing sadness he felt at Valadon's departure. It's often performed nowadays by rotating troops of pianists, so the part of the show is that somebody will take over and they'll get a sort of round of applause and stuff. But some have attempted it alone. The British-Australian musicologist Richard Toop was the first to accomplish the solo 28-hour version of this in 1967.
I mean, a lot of people say that 840 was probably like just trolling. Like a lot of people have said that he probably wasn't be serious when he wrote that, because it's the actual work in of itself isn't that long. The work itself, it's like half a page of music. Yeah. But the thing is, like, he was very, very into numerology, especially during his kind of mysticism days, during his Rosicrucian days. And, the 840 thing, I think a lot of people that have studied more of that era of him and have said there's a numerological significance to that. And so, if you see it a bit like casting a spell, he wrote a bit of very difficult music that was then meant to be repeated a very specific set of times that had a numerical significance to him. It's a little bit ritualistic, and that's kind of consistent with a lot of his beliefs from that era. So I'm not entirely sure that it was trolling, and he was fucking miserable. This is a guy that literally just turned to drink and was like celibate. Well, I don't know if he was celibate, but he was certainly emotionally celibate by all accounts for the rest of his life. So I'm not so sure. I don't see that as just a bit of a laugh. I see it as being something a little bit more profound and darker. I do think there's something to that. Interesting.
There's only really another couple that I'd like to pick out. One is from 1886. It's called Ogive, and I think it's Ogive in French maybe. It's a quietly beautiful, if quite repetitive, bit of music. He was only 20 years old when it was actually published, and this was just when he was embarking on his mystical period. So there's like gothic themes, medieval themes inside it, and maybe like a slight unearthliness, especially if you kind of contextualise it. As I say, it's one of his earliest works, but it's already apparent that it's totally distinctive and that he's a nonconformist. And yeah, I think it's sparse enough as well to very clearly illustrate that pushing away from romanticism and maximalism that we spoke about with regards to, like, for example, his rejection of Wagner. The last collection we have to mention, and it would probably have been a good choice for the episode, but it's not my favourite musically, is Musique d'ameublement. Which is basically, I think, literally translated furnishing music. Some people could translate it as furniture music. This was in 1917, and this is massive in terms of contemporary music. I mean, we've spoken about maybe his influence on popular structure, we've spoken about minimalism, we've spoken about incorporating elements of like ragtime and jazz a little bit. We'll talk about that shortly. Musique d'ameublement is basically the beginnings of ambient music, right? And I don't just mean in the sense that it's quiet. It is conceptually the beginnings of ambient music. So under that umbrella of ambient music, I include like elevator music, colloquially, or indeed music. All the generic intentionally meaningless background scoring that we just take for granted and encounter every day. And in fact, we just tune out because we really do treat it as ambient music now. It's funny and ironic that Erik Satie took the hump because people weren't treating it as background music. They were paying too much damn attention to it that he gave up on it. He wanted it to sit in the background and be ignored, and people kept stopping their conversations to watch it being performed, and that was exactly the opposite of the point. Although other selections of Satie's music have sort of retrospectively been sort of described as being ambient or furniture music, he only ever applied the name to these 5 short pieces, and they were composed in basically 3 different sets. The first set, Tapisserie en fer forge, was for the arrival of guests in a vestibule. Carrelage phonique was for during lunch or at a civil marriage, which is pretty specific. The second set, Son Industriel, were to be performed on unconventional instruments. They included Chez un bistrot, which is obviously music for a bistro. Or un salon, which was for a drawing room or a living room or a kind of background entertaining music, but not to interrupt the conversation. The third one was called a Tenture de Cabinet Préfectoral. And that was basically, that translates as wall lining in a chief officer's office. It's kind of shorthand known as furniture music number 3. It was commissioned in 1923 by a woman called Mrs. Eugene Meyer Jr., who was living in Washington DC, and I think she wanted it for a CEO's office effectively. But they were part of a set that was very specifically intended not to be listened to. That whole kind of collection was first revived in the early 60s thanks to John Cage, very famous experimental musician who embraced that minimalism and also embraced the conceptual element. It went on to influence a lot of neoclassical and modern composers and performers. And by the way, John Cage also famously performed Vexations, the one we mentioned earlier, in its entire faithful 28-hour, 840 repetitions form. So that's some of the highlights of Erik Satie's career, some of the more notable stuff beyond Gnossienne, but I'd really like us to talk about Gnossienne, go through the tracks. Again, I'm going to use some of Robert Rowett's opinions from that article for the CBC. Some of his reflections on it are great. To be clear, Gnossienne, to set the scene, was originally written as 3 pieces. Now, 3 further pieces, we're looking at Gnossienne 1 to 6, 3 further pieces, numbers 4 to 6, were added posthumously as late as 1968, and they were taken from that copious amount of material that I mentioned being discovered in his crazy apartment on his death. They were never labelled by Erik Satie as Gnossienne, and I suspect he really would never have approved of them or their inclusion as such, but we'll discuss the genesis. Gnossienne 1 to 3 are generally thought to have been written about 1890. They were published in Le Figaro, a very famous publication in France, in September 1893. Those original ones were written during his kind of mystical Rosicrucian phase, although by the second publication of them, by the time they were starting to get popular, he'd broken away from the religious beliefs. Now, we spoke earlier on about Satie's music being quite simple, being quite stripped back, but a famous composer and musician called Philip Corner once observed that if Satie's pieces are so easy, why are they so badly played? That was in the liner notes to his own album called Satie Slowly. Now, Satie Slowly, he had a take in it that was very languid, that was very felt. Some people try and really play them a lot faster. There is no meter at the start of Satie's music. for a lot of this. You know, there is no meter and there is no bar division. It is literally just lines with notes, and the interpretation. No time signature. The interpretation of the performance is down to the performer, and that has, as Dave was saying, led to a huge diversity in how they sound.
I want to say no time signature apart from one, which we'll talk about in a second.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, Corner, who had been influenced by Satie and also John Cage, with this album, Satie slowly said he sought to reclaim the works from those who use them as, quote, aromatherapy for the cochlea. Now, I mentioned Robert Rowett. Some of his musings on Trois Gnossienne. Satie did not write preludes, etudes, sonatas, impromptus, or music belonging to other established piano forms. With Trois Gnossienne, he invented a new genre and coined a new term for solo piano pieces written in free time. They are the successors of his early Gymnopédie and Sarabande, except with the subtle ornamentation that points to the powerful influence of the Far East on what he described as fin de siècle French art. So you were saying there's hints of like almost rock scales in it, and I think Rowett really agrees with that. You can hear a lot of like Middle Eastern influence appear in it. Rowett asks, is this music to accompany some ancient Eastern ritual? Satie's Rosicrucian leanings may be shown here. In Trois Gnossienne, the effusive expression of so much late romantic music has been left in the dust. Satie is waving goodbye to Richard Wagner. Gone are the crescendos, climaxes and crashing chords of 19th century piano music, and in their place we get spare textures and complete emotional detachment. There's no more narrative, just a neutral unfolding of modal melody over a spare chordal backdrop. These pieces erase any doubt that Satie was a musical innovator on the level of Debussy or Ravel. So yeah, I mean, to look at the 6 individual components of Gnossienne, Gnossienne number 1. These all come with instructions. This was standard on annotated music. Like, in the first work, he instructs the player to perform, quote, monotonously and whitely. I think I can do that. I mean, I do this podcast monotonously and whitely, don't I?
Very whitely, yeah.
But also very shiningly, which is another thing he requested.
And questioning. No. Wonder about yourself on the tip of the tongue.
Yeah. Ask insistently within yourself, arm yourself with clairvoyance, and to dig into the sound while playing with great kindness. Not as much as Gymnopédie, which we spoke about, but Gnossienne have been used in films and TV quite a bit, including Chocolat, 2000. But they were also in The Queen's Gambit. Now, Mark, what's that phrase for music where it's played in
diegetic?
Diegetic. Mm-hmm. Right, so I think it's a character called Alma that actually plays it on the piano during the show.
That's right, yeah.
But then as the show continues, I think it's whenever the character of Beth is playing chess, there's a lot of piano stuff that is quite clearly modelled around Erik Satie music to reflect the pieces that Alma is playing. Gnossienne 1 is a lean song. It's got like a signature lack of preamble to it. It just starts. The first theme's established immediately. It's got like a really subtle yearning quality and an unmistakable melancholy to it. We spoke about the sort of A, B, C, A, C sort of structures. The chorus motif, if you will, provides some relief from the melancholy with a bit more emphasis in the higher notes and played a bit more forcefully. The third motif incorporates like a gently stepped ascending line before you return back to the original themes. I think it's a beautiful, sad, slightly mysterious piece of music that walks a fine line between maybe melancholy and like a bit of intrigue. Yeah. Something a little bit odd about it, a little question mark to it.
Yeah, I really love the cadence of it. I mean, there's something otherworldly about it. You know, that the melody feels tranquil but also melancholic, like you say. It feels anachronistic. It feels really out of time. It feels like it has no place in the canon of music. You know, it feels as though it could have came at any period in the last 300 years. You know
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
It really does feel really timeless. Like,
you can also tell that it's a sort of development from, you know, the previous gymnopody. Is that correct? Gymnopody?
Yeah,
because
right.
Gymnopody is, maybe it's because you've heard it so much, but it's still fairly structured and romantic, whereas this is like far more timeless, kind of ethereal, and both in structure and just in atmosphere as well.
I'm not a musical.
Yeah, it's a really interesting piece of music.
I'm not super into my theory, although I know a wee bit about it, but it sounds like to me, I haven't looked into this too much, but it sounds like to me that it's like it modulates between two different minor keys, which gives it that weird alien feeling. It doesn't really feel as it feels different. If you listen to piano music, it sounds familiar. Like it sounds like something you would hear like any band do, right? Because it's in a minor key, but when you hear it on piano, it feels a bit out of place in a sense, and that's what I quite like about it. I think it's
I love that timelessness of it. I think that's astonishing. It's simply beautiful music to put on and walk about. I'm almost sad that it's as short as it is, because you really get into it. It really draws you in, but because of his brevity, quite quickly you're expected to move on, and that's actually a bit of a drag because it's glorious. And Gnossienne 2 is another track with kind of air of mysticism. Something kind of faintly Middle Eastern in it. This song, you know, I don't want to like go a little bit too American Beauty on us here, but it does drift about like something blown in the wind. It undulates really gracefully, and the speed of the playing kind of slows and speeds up in accordance with the strength of the playing. So the harder he plays, the faster it goes, and the softer he plays, the more it slows down, and it gives it such an organic human feel. Now, I'm sure that's been interpreted slightly differently by different performers. It's a gorgeous flowing thing that sort of conjures images of like fallen leaves, and the decay of those higher melodies really sounds like things dropping to earth. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's a lot more hopeful feeling than the first one. The first one's got a flat note in it. This one doesn't have any in it. It actually shifts from major to minor, which I think is what gives it the Eastern feeling. It's like the notes. Whenever I think about Eastern music, I always think about it as being playing the notes in between the notes. You know, the bends lingering on the notes in between the traditional Western scale as we know it. And I think this has got an element of that in it for sure, man. Which I think is because it's got some kind of minor in it, some kind of minor seventh maybe. And performance notes for this: don't leave with great kindness, more intimately. Don't be so proud when you play it. It's basically what you say.
The notes are amazing.
Crazy.
Yeah. Gnossienne 3, actually, among the papers that were discovered after his death was one bearing the sort of early signs of him trying to arrange this for a full orchestra, which would have been really, really interesting. It starts out immediately more and kind of intently sinister, I think, than the others. Albeit it then kind of quite quickly resolves with into a less intimidating passage of melancholy again. The gentle chords played by the left hand, I think, keep the right hand grounded a bit. The right hand threatens to get to run away.
Yeah, there's just a wee bit where it goes do 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 do, and then it calms down a little bit.
Exactly, and I think it's that left hand that sort of has a tranquilising effect on the right hand. It seems to just keep it from getting too full on.
I think that's actually reminiscent of the first one. It begins in the same way. In fact, I think it's a slightly more dissonant version of the first one. It feels more rocky. It feels really chromatic. You know, it actually feels like it is dark in the way that a traditional rock song would be compared to pop music. You know, again, it feels really out of time, really anachronistic, and it ends differently from the first one, which is pretty cool. Performance direction is counsel yourself cautiously, be clairvoyant, alone for a second. So to be as a whole very lost. Carry this further, think right, muffle the sound.
Fucking guy, man. Now we're going off the map a wee bit here, because Gnossienne 4 is not part of the original trio, clearly, and thus in Erik Satie's life, Gnossienne was just 3 parts. However, he had dabbled with additions. Gnossienne 4 was added posthumously by other people. It was apparently written, I think, about 1891, and was effectively in a D minor, which some people would call the saddest.
The saddest of all keys, yes.
It's potentially on there because of, I think, the amount of plaudits that the second section of it gets. It's seen by a lot of musicians as being particularly inspired bit of composition on Satie's part. The track actually begins vaguely reminiscent of Moonlight Sonata, but then kind of keeps going with the line and quickly develops into something darker and a bit more pessimistic, with almost like an Arabian thread weaving subtly through a bunch of Western style arpeggios. It's an unusual bit of writing, but it's really quite beautiful and quite an interesting combination of flavours.
Yeah, it doesn't quite land the same as the first 3 for me. It feels less exotic, if that makes sense. It's still pretty good, I think, from like 1 minute 50 onwards, when it switches into when it starts playing some major notes. That's when it feels inspired. That's when it feels like it should be in there. But before that, it just doesn't really feel as though it's got the same vibe. And that, I find that kind of a little bit off-putting, to be honest. Even though it's still in free time and it's got no key, even though it's in D minor, but it's got no key on the actual manuscript. But
so the next one, Gnossienne 5, Gnossienne number 5 is actually the earliest. It's from 1889, so 2 years prior to Gnossienne number 4, and it's potentially the first thing he wrote following the Gymnopédie that we spoke about earlier on. This
feels like it's really close to Gymnopédie for me. You could almost be part of that suite. I don't think it's as interesting, but you know, it's definitely very,
it feels
very
more
close to it.
theatrical. It feels like it's written for something, which like you can't really say about the rest of it. The other pieces exist because they have to exist, whereas this sounds like it's maybe written as a narrative to a slightly jaunty but confusing play.
Here's a really weird visual metaphor for you, Dave. I totally agree with you, right? So to describe it, I'd written it's a bizarrely uplifting inclusion that is genuinely outward looking. It scuttles quickly up the scale in little bursts that, when contrasted with the patient lower chord and basswork, seem to conjure images of a small animal darting playfully around another bigger, slower one as it walks steadily forward. Then I started thinking like Pixar and Disney, and then I thought, you know what this is like? This is like that little comic weasel guy in Ice Age bouncing around Manny the mammoth, as Manny the mammoth kind of stoically marches forward very rigidly. you know, whereas the other little bit of melody is playful and it kind of darts right, left, and, you know, up and down. You know, Mark, you mentioned earlier, this is uncharacteristic to the other Gnossienne because it includes a bar structure, and that gives it that metronomic sort of down, stoic forward movement, steady forward movement, whereas the other hand is clearly much more free.
Yes, it's actually got a time signature of 2/5. None of the other ones have any time signature at all. So it's like it just feels really out of place to me. Yeah, I think it is playful, and I do think it's really nice. It just feels out of place, you know. It just doesn't feel as though it sits very well here. I can't really understand why this would be posthumously added to this collection. To be honest, I really don't see that.
I think it's because of literally the chronology. I think because it came after Gymnopédie prior to Gnossienne, I think it's got to go somewhere in the minds of some people. As we said, I don't think Satie would have been pleased about it. Gnossienne number 6 is from 1897. It's the last of the pieces that were written that are included. His notes on it say avec conviction et avec une tristesse rigoureuse, which means with conviction and with a rigorous sadness. It's an interesting piece, quite downbeat, quite challenging. I don't know, the most dissonant of the 6, I think. It's quite obtuse. And
it sounds like things have just fallen apart. Yeah, it's a lot more somber, a lot more like chaotic, but, you know, fragile.
It has like a kind of jazziness to it, which is odd. It's got that jazzy awkwardness to it, and the song seems pretty intent on shunning the expectations of the listener, because every time you think it's going to resolve, or every time you think that the melody's going to develop a certain way, it seems to, like, somebody slaps the side of the TV set and it goes somewhere else. It's really odd, and you know, it's not part of the set that he envisioned, but I do think it's an interesting inclusion. I don't object to it, albeit it's an uneasy ending. It's a bit of a cliffhanger.
I mean, I like the dissonance in it. I think it is the most dissonant of this set, if you want to put them together as 6, which I think is ill-conceived, if I'm brutally honest. I don't mind this at all. I just think it's not as thematically strong as the first 3. I think that's a problem with the latter 3, right? Don't feel as thematically together as the first 3, and they do actually. I mean, they are good. I'm not going to deny that they're all good, but they just feel tacked on to me.
So it's probably worth noting that seeing that piece that we've mentioned a couple of times, 3 pieces in the shape of a pear, that does actually include a Gnossienne.
I heard that. I haven't listened to it, but I read about that. Yeah.
The first part of that is either, depending on your perspective, number 7 for us, or number 4, I'm sure, for Erik Satie. The reason for thinking that is based on correspondence he had with his publisher, where he specifically had labelled that first movement as Gnossienne. So whereas the 3 that we've mentioned, 4 to 6, were never credited by him as a Gnossienne, that first part of 3 pieces in the shape of a pear was. So it's worth, if you get a chance to listen to that, considering that in context, because that may have been number 4 in his eyes. Certainly that seems to be the way.
And 4 and 5 don't even have performance notes. The 6th one does have performance notes: without pride, a healthy superiority, very lost, knowingly. The other 2 don't have them, 4 and 5. I'd like to see the reasoning behind whoever added them to the collection.
Yeah, it just seems to have passed into the annals of, you know, received wisdom. I don't really think any one person was responsible for it. Like, just to sum up Erik Satie in a nutshell before we go and try and do a nexus with him to a 20th century cartoon, he had a huge impact on the likes of Claude Debussy, who was a huge musician in his own right, but also on the entire impressionist, inverted commas, musical movement, steering them away from like the grandiose stylings of Wagner and the Romanticism that were so in vogue at the time. I think it's also interesting to note that he supported and encouraged Debussy right up until the point where Claude Debussy became really popular, and then Satie derided his art as like being overly commercial. I mean, he was a really fickle, non-conformist guy. And you know what, Dave? You were talking about his like shambolic performance at the Conservatoire. I relate to his fickleness as well. I mean, how many people think I just hate anything that's popular? You know,
I still think that.
Biffy Clyro's manager definitely thinks that. So,
hi mate, how you doing?
Yeah, many classical composers at the time had also looked to folk music and, by the way, folklore for inspiration. And I say folklore because of the likes of Wagner, the way he courted the Völkisch movement, that sort of appeal to like past Aryan glories and all the shit that went along with the politics of that as well. And the Völkisch movement in general was really based in this mythological past. So a lot of these romantic writers and composers had really looked at both the legends and the structures of folk music. But Satie, I think, was one of the first classical, inverted commas, high art composers to really try and incorporate things like ragtime and jazz. It wasn't seen as being acceptable. He was incorporating influences, perhaps a little bit due to his own personal politics, but he was incorporating things that were kind of frowned upon. And it helped that he was so anti-establishment anyway that he didn't feel any shame or reluctance to incorporate those elements. It goes without saying, surely, that he inspired experimentalists like John Cage, who himself went on to break so many musical taboos and boundaries. I think the musical parade has to be acknowledged, as wacky as it was, for setting the scene, as I said, for that whole movement of musique concrete music, the very experimental thing of typewriters and sampling and field recordings and looping and all the, all the ways in which samples are now turned into percussion now. I mean, that was like something that this guy was doing. He had typewriters as percussion in a fucking theatre in the 19th century. That's incredible. His minimalism, I think, is very, very likely. I mean, I think it's a safe bet to say that it influenced the likes of Philip Glass and Michael Nyman and many, many, many others.
Yeah, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, everybody.
Yeah.
Even Brian Eno. Brian Eno was really, really influenced by furniture music.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps his biggest innovation credit, however you feel about it, might be musique d'ameublement. The furnishing music that became the ambient musical movement. I mean, this has impacted on everybody, feel like Boards of Canada, Aphex Twin, Stars of the Lid, all the way through to the extremely unhip music on phone lines, elevators, the loading screens in video games. The whole synthwave fucking concept is like a kind of weird ironic growth out of the ambient genre. I mean, that is such a fucking huge footprint for this guy who, let's be honest, most of you, if you got this far in the episode, didn't even know who he was. And I just think this guy is incredible. I really think he's an incredible character, an incredible musician, and whilst he missed the mark more often than he hit it, what he did land has left an enormous impact. And I just, it's important to, go out of our comfort zone. We are not skilled or equipped to be classical musical critics, but I think as everyday blokes, we can maybe see what this guy has done to the music that we listen to and what he's done to help push it to where it is and open all those doors and possibilities. And Erik Satie, fucking legend.
It's a good shout. I had Satie. I had like a couple of these tracks on like playlists for nice quiet piano.
His bath music.
And exactly. And I think I'd known about him from when I did Rachmaninoff for my advanced higher study thing, and like Rachmaninoff was quite clearly influenced by this as well. Yeah, you can see that reflection in it. But it's been a fun time reading about the guy, and in terms of an introduction to his music, this is as strong as you'll get. Certainly the 3 pieces, but the 6, fuck it, why not?
I mean, Gymnopédie is what most people see as his defining work. I just think there's something really beautifully understated about Gnossienne.
Yeah, it's a little bit more discordant, it's a little bit more ethereal, and I'm up for that. And you've probably not heard it as much.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we've got our yearly dose of wankiness out of the way, should we do an Nexus?
You're such a fucking cynic.
Sounds good.
We're trying to get a better standard of listener. We're trying to get rid of the riffraff that currently listen to the podcast and bring in some people with qualifications and proper jobs, and you're fucking pissing on it.
I guess you don't want success then, Chris. I guess you're just against that.
Well, I do in fact have a Nexus, and you will be amazed to know it's remarkably short.
A complicated series of connections between different things.
I'll go first, as is the norm. This week we are nexusing to Vicky the Viking, as chosen by our sometime co-host VJ Vicky Henry. How you doing, Vicky? Vicky the Viking. Wonder what made you think of that. Vicky the Viking is a Viking lad, controversially, recently shortened to Vic. I don't know much about Vicky the Viking. I've never watched it, but it's been about for fucking ages. It started in like
I get
60s.
a feeling that it's kind of like a German Asterix vibe.
No, I think it was Swedish, and then it got translated into German in like the 70s.
Right, okay.
We'll talk about that in a wee second.
Oh, well, it was big in Germany. It was big in Germany.
Sorry, Mark. Clearly, I'm giving the fucking spoilers away. Right, okay, so Erik Satie wrote Gymnopédie 1 to 3, obviously, and in the Gaspar Noé film Climax, you can hear a fucking inspired, a really, really interesting, innovative rendition of Gymnopédie by Gary Newman. On synth, adapted for synth, and it is fucking brilliant. It's really good. Gary Newman, what a job he did. What a film that is as well. I fucking love that film. Like all Gaspar Noé stuff, it's so intense. In 2012, if you care to go on his Twitter or just take my word for it, Gary Newman was at a Rammstein concert. There's pictures of him posing with the band. They're both outspoken fans of each other, and Gary Newman has talked in interviews after that concert specifically about the keyboardist Christian Lorenz surfing the crowd in a rubber dinghy right to the back of the room. Christian Lorenz's stage name was actually Flake, and the name Flake was taken from the village in Vicky the Viking, which was a cartoon he watched in the 70s when it was finally dubbed into German.
Staggering.
When are we doing a Rammstein episode, by the way?
Okay, man.
Next
Every
week.
episode's a Rammstein episode in my dreams.
I've got the same starting point, so that's brilliant.
Right, well, you have to repeat it for the audience who tuned out.
So in 1980, Gary Newman produced a track called Toi Gymnopédie, First Movement, which was the B-side to the single We Are Glass, which was the first song that he released from the album Telecon. A member of Gary Newman's live band is a guitar player called Rob Harris. He's a chap who was also part of a live band for a German electro act called Alphaville. You guys heard of them?
Only in name, I've never heard them.
Apparently they're quite influential.
It's a trick of my mind to face this bathing in the streamlight. She's so soft and warm in my arms. I tune it into the sea, my hands are resting on her shoulder.
After becoming a member of Alphaville, he then left in 1999 to join Jamiroquai. This is not part of the Nexus, but it's just funny to mention. It's not part of the Nexus, but I just want to mention.
I think that's the only band I hate more than Top Loader.
Yeah, same. He's also worked with such superstars as Beverly Knight, Kelly Minogue, Anastasia, the Lighthouse Family, Katy Perry, Will Young, Paloma Faith, Robbie Williams on the Lego Batman soundtrack.
This guy needs to disappear.
And Kanye West. Anyway, go back on topic. Alphaville are a really influential electro act, and they were actually really influenced by Gary Newman, and I was going to kind of use that as my jumping off point, but I thought, fuck it, let's go deeper. So There's a cover of the song, the Alphaville song Forever Young by a German rapper called Bushido. Bushido had a really famous guy called Karel Gott, who's a Czech singer, who did some vocals on that song in 2008. Karel Gott's quite interesting. He made music in two periods in his life, from 1958 to 1999 when he retired, and then he returned in 1996 when more people were listening to his music, and up until 2019 when he died. He'd won the Czech Nightingale Award for Outstanding Achievement in Annual Popularity in Czech Music, with the only exceptions being in 1998 and 2012. He is apparently the most successful and best-selling male pop singer in the history of Czech Republic, which is mental. Never heard of him before in my life. He has a song called Lady Carnival, which was written by a gentleman called Karol Svoboda, who is a Czech.
Don't even try.
Yeah,
don't even fucking try. Just skim past it and hope that the Czechs aren't listening.
Yeah, he's a Czech composer who helped write some pop hits, but was also the in-house composer for the German TV channel ZDF, which is the channel that Vicky the Viking was shown on in the 1970s.
Acceptable.
Great work.
Also, just to let you know, the TV series that was made in the 70s was also written by the guy that created the character, Runar Jonsson, who's Swedish, and it was a co-Austrian, German and Japanese production, and it ran for 3 seasons. So
Jings.
What the hell?
Mental.
So Erik Satie, as we've mentioned, has obviously influenced a lot of great work and great music, but none better than the UK garage classic Flowers by Sweet Female Attitude. A true fucking banger. I think you'll agree. Both the 5-minute the Sunship mix and the R&B Cutfather and Joe mix, both fucking superb. That was a one-hit wonder for Sweet Female.
How do you live with yourself? How do you live with yourself?
Look, I just like really good music, all right?
This was a highbrow episode and you have dragged it through the dirt.
Apparently, Flowers, the banger, was re-released and covered by DJ Spoony last year.
DJ Spoony.
DJ Spoony featuring the Sugar Babes.
Oh.
And it got to number 12 on the UK charts last year.
This just keeps getting worse.
Now, of course, I could have linked to the Sugar Babes directly from Gary Newman as well, because Freak Like Me, you know, sampled Gary Newman. Yeah. But no. I went via UK Garage Classic. Second album by Sugar Babes is Angels with Dirty Faces.
1.5
features this is Freak Like Me, Round Round, what else? Stronger.
This is just a Sound as a Pound episode now.
Angels with Dirty Faces took its name from the 1938 gangster film starring James Cagney and Pat O'Brien, which also ended up being sort of homaged in the Home Alone and Home Alone 2 films.
It's actually in it. It's actually in the film.
No, it's not. They were sort of remakes. It was Angels with Filthy Souls and Angels with Even Filthier Souls. They were not actually the film. They were just like sort of parodies of it.
Couldn't afford that, obviously.
James Cagney, one of his most famous, because he's, as well as being an actor, he's also a very famous dancer. One of his most famous dancing routines, and a highlight, he said, was dancing along a giant typewriter. And I think it was like a big part of something to sing about was the film, but it became a very sort of iconic dance that he did with Harlan Dixon and Johnny Boyle. And that was then homaged to by Tom Hanks in Big in 1988 when he danced along the piano. Tom Hanks voiced Woody in the Toy Story series, of course, probably his greatest achievement. In Germany, Toy Story, Woody was voiced by a man called Michael Bulli Herbig, and Michael Bulli Herbig also happened to be the director and starred in the 2009 Vicky the Viking movie.
We got there.
which was the first of the 2 live action comedies based on the OG series.
An absolutely brutal excursion through UK garage that, by Dave's own admission,
It's a fucking great song. Fuck off. I'll be doing it for not Sound as Pound, but for Unsong. All right.
Please do.
Shitting hell. Right. I appreciate he's entertaining me and humouring me on that episode. I really, really wanted to talk about this guy, and I'm really glad we can hopefully bring listeners something that's just a wee bit unusual. You know, I think it's really nice to just break it up. I realise that this episode may land like a turd in your drink, but we'll find out. But honestly, I think the guy's incredible and fascinating, and his music's beautiful, and it deserves to be acknowledged because he has been really overlooked. His influence is massive. But the next 2 weeks we've got something a little unusual planned, right? Next week, Mark, you can tell listeners what we're going to do. But the week after is Dave's choice, I believe.
So
I think a couple of us are away next week, which gives us a nice opportunity to do something. Mark?
so Dave mentioned something there called Unsong, which if you're not a subscriber of the podcast, you'll be like, what the fuck is Unsong? Well, you're going to find out next week. And that's all I'm going to say. That's it. You just need to tune in to find out.
And I also mentioned Sound as a Pound, and you're also going to find out what that is next week, because we're going to release 2 shorter episodes next week, which both have a distinct flavour, and they're things that our subscribers will be used to. This is part of us trying to bait you to go on our Patreon and give us a couple of bucks a month, but also I think you'll just enjoy a little bit of irreverence.
Of sidetrack, just doing something fun or
and then in 2 weeks' time we will be back to normal programming, and it's my choice, and I'm going for the 1995 record Paranoid and Sunburnt, the debut album by Skunk Anansie.
It's a bold move.
Yeah,
it's a bold fucking move. We're going into Brit rock, 90s Brit rock.
3 white guys talking about a black non-straight band. Awesome.
What'll be the nexus to that? The nexus shall be
Robbie Williams,
as chosen by Liam Berry, Evan Seinfeld.
I mean, that's probably we probably not get that in a oneer.
I mean, we'll definitely go via Pornhub. Okay.
Got them on the same Kerrang CD.
Okay, we'll be back. Well, you guys will hear us in a week's time, but we'll be back in 2 weeks' time for a much more lowbrow episode. There'll be no sparkling white wine and oysters. 150 oysters in one go.
Yeah.
Nobody really
sounds alright.
Nobody commented on that. I think that's pretty good going.
Can you guys do that?
Yeah.
And Dave, you can't. I mean, could you do that theoretically?
Dave could. Oysters are vegan.
Oysters don't have a central nervous system, so gobble them down.
There is a lot of disagreement in the vegan community about bivalves, but frankly, I'm on the side of anyone that puts an oyster in their mouth and swallows.
So if you want to sign up to Patreon, go to patreon.com/unsungpod, give us some cash, and then we'll film Chris
keep us in oysters
and David
boiled wine.
Fuck it, it's not a cheap habit.
Just fucking bring it in.
See you later, team. Thanks very much.